With a moving truck behind her, my mother-in-law said with a triumphant tone, "I won't be giving out our address to anyone." Behind her, my husband was getting into the car, grinning foolishly. He was seriously considering following his parents. I quietly bit my lip. This is always how they are. They do whatever they want, thinking I won't talk back. My father-in-law is a decent man but stuck in his old ways, believing a woman should obey her husband and be taken care of, so he's no help. But I had reached my breaking point. I had endured and endured, bottling everything up like water in a glass. And today was the last drop. Then, it's divorce with a freeloading husband, I declared. My in-laws just laughed in unison. Don't talk nonsense, stupid. They don't know yet that my husband relies financially on me, and that even the little income he does make is thanks to me. My father-in-law is a decent man but stuck in his old ways, believing a woman should obey her husband and be taken care of, so he's no help. My name is Hannah. I'm 50 years old. I work at a local supermarket managed by my brother. It was originally my parents' company, but my brother took over after my father, who was over 60, fell ill. It started as a small family business, but now it's a beloved store in the community. Though it's a store, it's structured as a company, so I hold a position. When my parents were working, my father was the CEO, and my mother was the executive vice president. However, since my brother's wife was a school teacher and couldn't be employed, I became the executive VP when my brother took over. Now, I live with only my husband, Ken. We have a daughter who's married and visits a few times a year. However, her and her husband's home is in a distant state, so we don't see them often. My husband and I were high school classmates. Back then, we were just classmates. At the time, Shymi hardly had any male friends, let alone a boyfriend. Compared to me, always with a few friends, popular Ken was always surrounded by friends. We reconnected as adults and got married after coming together. I like modest and demure women like you, Hannah, he said shyly as we pledged our future together. I realized choosing this was a mistake only when it was too late. Right after we got married, the relentless snide remarks from my mother-in-law began. Quit your job and devote yourself to Ken. And you'd better have kids soon, or you're no good as a wife, she first said. Back then, I was just an employee at the supermarket. My husband was still working normally, so I could somewhat understand my old-fashioned mother-in-law not getting my job. But saying I'm useless if I don't have kids felt like too much. Even after having our daughter, my mother-in-law didn't change. I gave birth to a girl. Then, my mother-in-law haughtily said, "Disappointingly, it's a girl. You need to have a boy soon." I had boys, you know. To me, my daughter was priceless, but to my mother-in-law, she was just a mere girl. My husband loved our daughter, but whenever we visited his parents, he never argued back against his mother. He even joined in mocking me. "She can't seem to have another kid. And her cooking's terrible, nothing like Mom's," he would say. Then, my mother-in-law would clap her hands in joy and laugh. Pleased, she would give my husband some spending money, and he'd happily buy liquor and magazines with it. "You could stand up for me a bit. And that's not fair to our daughter," I'd complain after we got home. My husband would just sigh in annoyance. "She's just a baby, she won't understand, you're worrying too much. Mom's happy if you just play along, just bear with it," he'd say. It was really hard, but it was just during visits to his parents, so maybe I should just swallow it. But my frustration never faded. I just kept enduring. However, things took a turn for the worse. Until then, we only met my mother-in-law when we visited her, but she started coming to our house. It all started when my husband lost his job. His company went under due to poor performance. With no income other than unemployment benefits. And those only temporary. We couldn't live on that alone. So, I took the offer from my brother for a full-time position with a title, and I started working in earnest. Our household came to rely on my income, with the grand cause of helping our son. My mother-in-law, armed with what she believed was a righteous cause, eagerly made herself at home in our house. My father-in-law seemed dismayed by her overprotectiveness, but my mother-in-law couldn't care less about his opinions. Her behavior was intense, to say the least. It seemed like everything I did was not to her liking. I was beyond dismayed when she took the laundry I had folded out of the dresser to refold it herself. I couldn't understand what drove her to go to such lengths. If she disliked it so much, I thought she didn't have to bother coming to a house where I was present. "Hannah, when are you gonna quit your job? It's because of you that Ken can't find a job." She had the audacity to blame me, the sole provider for our household. I looked at my husband, hoping for some support, but he awkwardly avoids my gaze. It wasn't my fault that my husband couldn't find a job. He had no qualifications and his experience was only in clerical work without any special skills. It would have been fine if he wasn't so picky about jobs, insisting, "I hate anything but clerical work. I can't do physical labor. I also can't work late nights." Essentially, it was his own doing that he couldn't find a job. Yet, in my mother-in-law's eyes, me working seemed to be the reason my husband lacked motivation and was the root of all evil. The same old story went for our children. "Granny's here," she would say, yet she openly stated that girls were of lesser value than boys. When our daughter, old enough to understand, started avoiding her grandmother who only made disparaging remarks, my mother-in-law snapped, "You're just like your mother. Not cute at all." My daughter was shocked, and my husband did nothing but lie in front of the TV, not bothering to intervene. "There's no need to talk like that. If you dislike us, you don't have to come over." Unable to contain my frustration, I confronted her, to which she arrogantly replied, "This is my son's house. If you have a complaint, you're the one who should leave." Let me reiterate, my husband was unemployed, and I was the one supporting the household. It infuriated me how my mother-in-law refused to see reality. And seeing my husband just lying around every time I heard those words only added to my sadness. When I reported this to my father-in-law, it seems he scolded my mother-in-law out of his love for his granddaughter. After that, my mother-in-law stopped making remarks about my daughter and reduced the frequency of her visits to our house by half. Years later, my husband decided on a life without work, fully becoming a freeloader. Meanwhile, I contributed to the supermarket's sales by coming up with new ideas from a housewife's perspective and focused even more on my work. When the supermarket was hiring part-time workers, I suggested to my husband, "It's an easy job. Why don't you give it a try?" Eventually, he managed to get employed, working just twice a week. During a visit to my in-laws for a holiday, my husband proudly reported his employment. Though it wasn't entirely his own doing, I thought it was better than nothing and watched over him warmly. "Ken finally found a job. He's truly remarkable. Work hard and shut your wife up, make her quit her job soon. A wife's place is in the home, after all," my mother-in-law said in a voice loud enough for others to hear. Furthermore, during visits to the cemetery, she would start gossiping about me to acquaintances and neighbors. "My daughter-in-law just makes pocket money at her parents' company. It's truly shameful. She neglects her household duties, making my son suffer," she would complain, leaving me to endure being ridiculed in public. "Stop, it's disgraceful." The only person who tried to intervene was my father-in-law. As for my husband, who ignored it all, my feelings of sadness only grew. I endured it all, continuing to put up with everything. If only my mother-in-law would stop coming over, my husband, despite being a lazybones, was a kind father. For the sake of my daughter, I thought it best for her father to be around until she was independent. Even when I no longer needed to endure, I didn't have the energy to initiate a divorce. The dwindling visits from my mother-in-law over the years played a big part. This year brought a turning point. My in-laws were moving from their long-standing single-family home to a condo. "We're making it our final home. The view from the balcony is great," my father-in-law said excitedly, appearing more lively than usual. I could relate to their desire to downsize from a house that was too large to a life that fit just right. Packing was truly a challenge. The family home was overflowing with belongings, and a significant purge was necessary to fit everything into the smaller condo space. There were clothes that were either too big or out of fashion and couldn't be worn, along with a plethora of paper bags. Even gifts like unopened gift boxes surfaced. Some of which, like towels, could be sold, but food past its expiration date had to be discarded. The amount of dishware, too excessive for just 2 people, certainly needed to be reduced. We can't keep everything. I understand how you feel, but the new place is smaller than this, isn't it? Most of the items that needed to go were my mother-in-law's. Naturally, she was highly resistant to me touching them. Are you saying nonsense because you want my things? How shameful! Fuming over what she deemed unworthy of desire, my mother-in-law glared at me. I decided it was a lost cause to argue and shrugged it off, making my exit. The day of my in-laws' move finally arrived. I hadn't been told the exact location of their new condo. Regrettably, I wasn't particularly eager to know and planned to wait until they felt like sharing. The moving truck was the smallest size available, a compact truck. Watching it get loaded up, I worried whether everything would fit, and sure enough, items started to overflow. Then, my husband began loading our car with the excess. Next, my in-laws got into the car, leaving no room for me. Stunned, I watched as my husband started the engine with a smug look. In a panic, I knocked on the car window. Honey, what's the meaning of this? Are you taking your parents? Should I just wait here? My husband cracked open the window and declared, You can find your own way back. I'm gonna live with my parents. Call off work for a while, will ya? See ya. As I stood there dumbfounded, the back seat door opened. Out stepped my mother-in-law. With a triumphant expression, she announced, Ken said he suffers from being scolded by his wife every day, so we decided to take him with us. Reflect on your loneliness and think about what you've done. After finishing her declaration, she made a point to nudge my shoulder. Reluctantly, I asked, For emergencies, could you tell me your new address? We don't give out our address to strangers. This time, I was truly speechless. I had reached my breaking point and felt utterly deflated. It felt like all the endurance I had accumulated over the years had finally spilled over. Today was the last straw, I realized. Then, it's divorce for me and my freeloading husband. I stated calmly, though I put a tiny emphasis on freeloading. My mother-in-law, standing right before me, clearly heard me. She glanced at my husband, but quickly regained her composure, glaring at me venomously. My father-in-law, having been in the car, seemed not to catch what was said and came out asking, Huh? I made sure he heard me this time, announcing clearly, I'm divorcing Ken in his current freeloader state. Please take him with you. I won't be bothered with him anymore. Thank you for everything up to now. As I bowed politely, my in-laws laughed, drowned out by the sound of the engine. Don't talk nonsense, stupid. They both seemed to grasp the seriousness of the situation. Resting his elbow on the open window, my husband looked up at me with a slight smile. A working Ken can't be a freeloader. You won't be able to live without me. I found my father-in-law's grimace pitiable. Thinking to myself that it's his son who won't be able to live, I tilted my head. You do know about my income, right? My father-in-law shook his head in denial. In front of a surprised me, my mother-in-law yelled with frustration. Acting all high and mighty when you're just living off your parents' allowance. It finally dawned on me at this point. My in-laws really knew nothing about our financial situation. At the very least, I had told my mother-in-law when I took my current job. Maybe she forgot because it was a long time ago, or perhaps she never intended to understand. Either way, I hadn't expected them to be this uninformed. But now, that doesn't matter anymore. All right then. I'll send the divorce papers later, I said, feeling oddly relieved. I was tired of explaining. Once I made up my mind, strangely, my heart stopped stirring. Then my husband chimed in. You can't send them if you don't know the address. You're more clueless than I thought. He laughed, ushering his parents into the car before honking the horn shortly and driving away. I silently watched them leave. Returning home by taxi, I promptly went to the lawyer's office. Not knowing the current address wasn't a problem. My mother-in-law subscribes to several mail order supplements, so it should be fine. I chose to send the divorce paper. On my way back, I prepared several extra copies of the divorce paper, thinking about what I'd do if the one I sent got torn up. A few days later, my phone rang. I thought it might be my husband. But it was my father-in-law. "Hello? The divorce papers arrived. Are you serious? This is going too far for just making a point." I chuckled at the thought that he still considered this just a bluff after all this time. I had thought he was reasonable, but perhaps he's just another member of that family, after all. "Of course, I'm serious. You can file it there, or I've included a return envelope so you can send it back to me. Don't worry about my livelihood. I am, after all, an executive of a company, so I do have an income." I responded firmly. Then my father-in-law muttered, seemingly perplexed. "A woman being a company executive, is that even a thing?" He still seemed doubtful. I remembered telling him before that our company was small and that I was the executive, but how had he taken that? Maybe he never really listened. Or perhaps he misunderstood due to his poor hearing. "There are female executives in other companies too." "Well, you don't have to believe me, but I've reached my limit. I've had enough," I replied, without the intention to explain further. "Simply tired." Then, my father-in-law grunted lowly. "I see. If that's how it is, I won't say anything more. Sorry for all the trouble we've caused." I could tell from his strained voice that he genuinely felt sorry. It seemed that my father-in-law was the only somewhat reasonable person on their side after all. Relieved, I politely responded, "No, thank you," and hung up. Half a day after my father-in-law's call, the next one I got was from my husband. I was out when my smartphone rang, and seeing my husband's name, I decided to turn on the recording feature and start the conversation. "Hey, this is terrible, suddenly demanding a divorce. Sending this and threatening to sue me. If you don't change your mind, you'll regret it." He blustered, even though he was the one who unilaterally moved out. And since he declared me a stranger and left without giving an address, it's only natural for me to consider divorce. It was infuriating how he acted like he was the victim. Continuous emotional abuse is the main reason, you know. It's sad that the diary I've kept since I was young will serve as evidence. You leaving on your own in this case seems to admit fault on your part. That's what the lawyer said. I explained, while my husband kept interrupting with "huh" and "what" in a rude manner. His attitude made me wonder if he was listening at all, but when I mentioned the lawyer, he suddenly panicked. "A lawyer, huh? You can't be serious." My husband's voice trembled around us. I had the phone on speaker mode, so the person in front of me could hear as well. Smiling reassuringly at them, I firmly responded, "Of course, I'm serious. Right now, I'm actually in consultation. From now on, let's stop discussing directly and go through our lawyers." As I was about to say please communicate through them, my husband interrupted with a shout. "No way, I won't agree to a divorce. What about my job? It's going to be awkward. Let's meet and talk this over. I'm coming over right now, hear me out." I couldn't help but chuckle hearing my mother-in-law in the background saying, "Just let him go," her voice barely audible. The person across from me, the lawyer I was consulting, looked amused as if to say, "Oh dear." As I pondered what to do, the lawyer quickly jotted down a note and showed it to me. It read, "Invite him to this office." Following that advice, I instructed my husband. "I'm not at home right now, I'm at the lawyer's office. If you insist on talking, come here." After giving him the office address, he assured he would come and hung up. Sipping the coffee provided by the office staff, I waited for my husband's arrival. I wonder if he'll actually come. He's quite cowardly, he might just run away. But soon enough, my husband arrived. I had expected a one-on-one confrontation with him and the lawyer, but surprisingly, he wasn't alone. His parents accompanied him. It seemed he said, "I can't do this alone," and had brought his mommy and daddy along. The lack of independence was astounding. Entering the office, my husband appeared nervous. His eyes darted around. The lawyer sat beside me, ready to face the three of them. Here it was, the direct confrontation. "Look, I just can't think of divorcing. It's unimaginable." Facing me across the table, my husband began speaking in a hurried whisper. A stark contrast to his yelling over the phone. I remained unwavering. "No, I absolutely want a divorce. I never want to live with you again. Since we're here with a legal expert, let's also discuss the division of assets." My husband jolted, then glanced at the lawyer before clamping his mouth shut. He could act tough with me or female employees, but in front of a male lawyer, he was nothing but meek. I sighed. My husband said nothing more, and my father-in-law just sat there with his arms crossed, eyes shut. Turning to my mother-in-law, who was glaring at me without trying to hide her fury, she spat out, "What assets? We're not sharing a penny with you," just as she tried to throw her freshly served hot coffee at me. The office staff quickly intervened, narrowly avoiding disaster. Technically, since we were married, any income earned should be split between Ken and me, as that's the legal viewpoint. But if both parties agree, that changes. "Fine, let's say no division of assets then." I coolly agreed, my face unbothered. Most of the income was mine, and the bank accounts holding our assets were in my name. Ironically, the car Ken proudly drives around is also registered in my name. His bank account had barely $40 before payday, essentially leaving him with next to nothing. Opting for no asset division meant I kept everything. Despite the glaringly bad situation for him, Ken remained silent, just fidgeting. "Are you sure about this?" I asked as if speaking to a child. My father-in-law, who had been silent, then whispered to Ken, "Tell the truth." But Ken was non-committal. Mumbling a weak aha, he astonishingly laid his head in his mother's lap. My mother-in-law, while stroking his head, continued to glare at me. I realized then what being utterly repulsed felt like. In the end, Ken and I agreed to divorce without any division of assets. Hastily, I pulled out a spare divorce form I had brought, and Ken's face turned even more pitiful. As they left, my father-in-law made eye contact and nodded significantly. Watching them go, I reflected that he wasn't exactly on my side but wasn't an enemy either. He might hold the belief that men are superior to women, but he could acknowledge his mistakes. After my in-laws and husband left, I finally allowed myself a smile. The lawyer beside me had been unusually quiet, apparently biting the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. It's understandable, given that the very person we were supposed to be discussing asset division with had willingly given up everything. After the meeting, I quickly submitted the divorce papers I had obtained. I was free. But it wasn't over yet. The following week, Ken, now my ex-husband, boldly showed up at my workplace. It would have been fine if he just worked normally, but that was too much to ask. He completely ignored his own work and clung to me instead. "Hannah, I was wrong. You haven't filed the divorce papers yet, right? I'll come back home, so let's make up soon," he said. I had my job, and we were in different areas of work. Having him follow me was a nuisance. No matter how many times I told him to return to his post, he wouldn't listen. Instead, he jumped out in front of me in the store and sprawled out on the floor. "Please!" he screamed, flailing his legs and drawing the attention of the customers. This was truly unbearable. I decided to fire him. My brother, along with all the employees, agreed with the decision. In fact, there had been multiple complaints about Ken's work attitude from other employees. It was only because of my insistence that he had been kept on. Naturally, no one was sorry to see him go. The next day, our supermarket was in turmoil again. "My son has been fired because you must have said something," my mother-in-law yelled, fuming with anger. For the time being, I ushered her into the break room in the back. At my brother's suggestion, we called Ken and also asked my father-in-law to come. With my brother and a few employees watching, the final discussion began. First, I explained about Ken's disgraceful behavior the day before. Then, I addressed my mother-in-law's accusation of "you must have said something to the company." "There's nothing to say, I decided to fire him. That kind of behavior is disruptive to business, it's impossible to keep him employed." Hearing my response, my father-in-law, seemingly impressed, said, "You have the authority to do that?" Everyone from our side nodded in agreement. Ken, presumably aware of this, shrank even smaller. Only my mother-in-law seemed shocked. I calmly presented the facts. "Certainly, I do. I'm the assistant manager and executive director. In our small company, almost everything is decided directly by the president and me." "Executive director?" My mother-in-law finally seemed to grasp my position, turning pale as she shook Ken, trying to make him look up. Ignoring them, my father-in-law continued. "So, you were the bigger earner?" I nodded slowly. Yes, Ken was only a part-time worker twice a week. He couldn't possibly match my executive compensation. It's not even close to 1/10, more like 100th. And he used to say my job was just thanks to my parents' connections, but Ken was 100% hired through my connections. Looking back, that was a mistake. This outcome is actually more appropriate. At this point, my mother-in-law was speechless. It should be clear who supported the household without even having to think about it. "It's just revenge, mixing personal issues with business," Ken shouted. It's time he looked for another job, considering the situation. His desire to still work here is incredibly thick-skinned. "The issue is your poor conduct. There have been complaints from other employees about you, like sleeping in the break room during work hours or making inappropriate comments to female employees. You know this because I've scolded you each time, right? Oh, you ran away with your parents because you couldn't stand being scolded?" My voice dropped as I spoke. Ken started crying out loud. "My son would never do such things." Before my mother-in-law could rant further, I presented evidence. There were multiple records of his misconduct, captured on surveillance cameras and recordings made by other employees. Frankly, I feel like I should be docked pay for defending such a person in the past. My mother-in-law was dumbfounded. Instead of consoling Ken, she pinched his ear fiercely. "What are you doing?" Ken screamed, protecting his head. My mother-in-law's anger didn't stop. She began hitting him with a cushion we were sitting on. With no other option, I turned to my father-in-law, who was still sitting and watching us. I had to secretly help out alongside the part-timers to cover for him not working. I apologized and gave gifts to those he inconvenienced. It was all my foolishness. I'm sorry for the trouble caused to other employees. I'm relieved he's finally been fired." My mother-in-law was sobbing with frustration. My father-in-law, looking solemn, apologized to all of us employees. "Let's go home. Hannah, I'll have a word with Ken. I promise we won't bother you again. Thank you for everything," he said as he stood up. I believed he would keep his promise. Hearing this, my ex-husband looked like it was the end of the world for him. My mother-in-law, gritting her teeth, then angrily whispered, "Why would you say that? It's a huge loss. We must reconcile for Ken's sake." It seemed she finally understood the reality of Ken's situation. Despite her newfound desire not to let me go. As if my absence would spell the end for Ken. I had no intention of helping. But just as I was about to respond, a loud voice filled the room. "Enough is enough!" My father-in-law roared in anger. His imposing stance reminded me of a guardian deity. Even my mother-in-law couldn't retort and just looked down, mouth agape. Ken, having felt his real father's wrath, cowered in fear. "A daughter-in-law is still a daughter you received from somewhere else. At the end of the day, she's a stranger. Don't think about leeching off her. Aren't you ashamed? And today, it's clear that Ken has been a nuisance. Ken, apologize right now." I was taken aback by such intensity from my father-in-law, who was usually quiet. Maybe I didn't fully understand my in-laws after all. In the end, Ken didn't apologize, shielded by his mother, and they left in a hurry. My father-in-law turned back one last time. "Thank you. Take care," I said, returning the gesture. I decided to forgive him. "Let's get back to work," I announced, and the supermarket returned to its routine. That's the story for later. Afterward, my in-laws faced a tough life, supporting their jobless son in his 50s on their pension. When I occasionally saw my mother-in-law in town, she seemed utterly defeated, a shadow of her former self. Rumor had it that Ken had become a recluse, utterly useless. I haven't seen him since then. A few years later, I heard from my daughter about my father-in-law's funeral, which took place about 3 years after the divorce. Being his granddaughter, she attended. It seemed his death was sudden, with no preparations made. The funeral was modest due to insufficient funds. Now living alone with her son, my mother-in-law's life was far from smooth. Without the cleanliness-obsessed father-in-law, their home quickly turned into a hoarder's den and became the talk of the neighborhood. Furthermore, they became even more disliked in the community for begging for money, apparently struggling significantly. Thinking of the lonely and tough life ahead for my mother-in-law and ex-husband, I felt no inclination to help. Instead, I felt a sense of relief from all the past frustrations. Years have passed, and I now enjoy living alone in a lovely apartment. I never knew how wonderful it could be to have free time all to myself. Inviting friends of the same age for dinner parties has become my greatest joy. My daughter and her husband also care for me. My daughter, who always disliked her grandmother, plans to cut off all contact with her. That's for the best. Especially now, with your condition, it's better to stay away from stress. There's no need to let the baby meet her. As she caressed her slightly grown belly, she nodded in agreement. I was about to become a grandmother. Of course, I'm willing to do anything to help my daughter and her family. However, I also want to make sure not to intrude too much on the young couple's life. As I approach my 60s, among my friends, there are those who chose to remain single or were widowed. Lately, we've been discussing possibly living together in a retirement community of single ladies in the future. This time, I dream of a life where we can discuss anything without having to hold back, unlike before. Surrounded by much happiness, I'm sure I'll continue to live my best days from now on.